There is a kind of silence that settles over England on autumn evenings that has nothing peaceful in it. I have known it in many houses, in many counties, over the long course of a life spent listening closely to the stories that other people believed no one had noticed. It is the silence of things held in careful suspension, of truths not yet spoken, of consequences not yet arrived, of the particular breathless quality that comes just before something breaks open and cannot be put back together in quite the same way it was before. I first heard of Elara Voss on one such evening, though the story itself had begun years earlier, in the way that the most significant stories always do, quietly and without announcing themselves as stories at all. She was 22 years old in the autumn of 1874, and she lived in a 2-room cottage at the edge of the village of Ashford Crossing, which sat at the foot of the valley that rose toward the Ravensmoor estate. The cottage was not hers by deed. Nothing in her life was hers by deed, which is a circumstance I shall explain in its proper time. But she had lived in it for 11 months, long enough to know every draught that came under the ill-fitted door and every spot in the roof that wept when the rain was heavy. She had whitewashed the walls herself. She had repaired the window latch with a piece of wire and the particular ingenuity of someone who has learned that no one is coming to fix things for her. She had made it habitable, if not comfortable, and she had done this while working 6 days a week as a laundress for 4 households in the village, returning each evening with arms that ached to the bone and fingers that had forgotten what it felt like not to be raw. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her grandmother, Nell Voss, 71, with the sharp eyes of a woman who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by any of it, occupied the single bed. Elara slept on a narrow pallet she folded each morning and stored against the wall. This was not a complaint. It was simply the arrangement. Elara did not, as a rule, permit herself complaints about the arrangement of things she could not change. She had inherited this quality, among others, from her father. Thomas Voss had been the estate manager of Ravensmoor for 22 years. He had managed the farms, the tenant accounts, the household inventories, and the seasonal labor, with a diligence that the late Duke, Edmund's father, had trusted completely and rewarded accordingly. Not generously by the standards of the great estates, but fairly, which in that era was a thing worth noting. Thomas had lived with his daughter and his mother in a cottage on the Ravensmoor lands proper, warm in winter and with a kitchen garden that Elara had tended since she was old enough to hold a trowel. She had grown up among the estate's rhythms. She had learned to read from her father's account books as much as from any primer. She knew what turnips and barley and wool cost, and what they were worth, and what it meant when those two figures diverged. And she knew all this because Thomas Voss had believed, with the quiet conviction of a man who had been denied formal education himself, that his daughter would not be denied it. He had also, before he became an accountant, been the estate's head groom. He knew horses the way some men know languages, not through study, but through a long and patient attention that had become, over the years, something closer to conversation. He had taught Elara everything he knew. That particular inheritance would matter very soon. Thomas Voss had died 14 months ago. Not dramatically. Nothing about him had ever been dramatic. A fever in February that came on quietly and did not leave. He died at home, with Elara holding one of his hands and Nell holding the other. And the last thing he said to his daughter was something she had been turning over ever since. "Keep the ledgers safe, Ellie. Whatever else happens, keep them safe." She had kept them. They were under the floor of the cottage, not the cottage on the Ravensmoor estate, because that cottage, along with everything else that had been Thomas Voss's by right of 22 years of faithful service, had been taken from them within a fortnight of his death. It had been taken by the man who now ran Ravensmoor with the absolute authority of a man who has long since ensured there is no one above him paying attention. His name was Silas Crane. He was the estate steward. He had arrived at the position 6 years ago, quiet and capable and entirely unremarkable. And he had in those 6 years made himself so indispensable to the running of the estate that the late Duke, in his final illness, had handed him nearly complete control. And the current Duke, preoccupied with London and grief and the complicated business of inheriting an estate he had not expected to inherit so soon, had seen no reason to question an arrangement that appeared, from a distance, to be functioning adequately. What it had been functioning as, from a distance that Thomas Voss had begun to measure with growing alarm in the last 2 years of his life, was a machine for transferring the Duke of Ravensmoor's income into Silas Crane's private accounts. The ledgers beneath Elara's floor contained 6 years of evidence: altered figures, falsified invoices, payments recorded and never made, rents collected and never remitted. Thomas Voss had documented it all with the meticulous precision of a man who understood that evidence, to be useful, must be irrefutable. He had done it quietly, carefully, and entirely alone, because he had understood from the beginning what it would cost him if he was discovered before he was ready. He had not been ready in time. Crane had understood the threat before it fully materialized, and he had moved against Thomas Voss with the methodical efficiency of a man who had thought carefully about how to remove an inconvenient truth from the world. Not through violence. Crane was too careful for violence, but through the slower instruments of institutional power. A series of formal complaints about the management of the home farm, a suggestion that certain accounts had been kept irregularly, a recommendation delivered to the Duke by letter with appropriate regret that the estate manager's position be reviewed. Thomas Voss had been dismissed 6 months before his death, his pension withheld on grounds of the irregularities Crane himself had manufactured, his family expelled from the cottage that had been their home for 20 years. The cottage had been reassigned to the new stable master within a week. What Crane had not anticipated was the ledgers. He had searched the cottage before the family left. He had found nothing. He had told himself that Thomas Voss, a dying man broken by dismissal and the loss of everything he had built, had perhaps destroyed them in despair or illness. He had told himself this with the practiced conviction of a man who needs to believe something and has sufficient discipline to manage the believing. He had been wrong, and somewhere in the back of his careful, calculating mind, he had never been entirely certain he was right. The storm that changed everything arrived on the 14th of October, in the 3rd week of the Duke's announced, though long delayed, return to Ravensmoor. The village of Ashford Crossing had been speaking of it for a fortnight, in the speculative, half-reverent tones that the village always reserved for the Duke of Ravensmoor. Edmund Harcastle was 34 years old. He had inherited the title 3 years earlier, upon the death of his father, and he had managed his estates since then from London, communicating with his steward by letter, visiting his properties in the north, but not, noticeably, pointedly not, Ravensmoor itself. The estate staff whispered theories. The village drew its own conclusions. What was generally agreed upon in the houses and the lane and the single public room of the Ashford Arms was that the new Duke was not his father. The old Duke had walked his own fields. He had known the name of every tenant farmer and every tenant farmer's wife and most of the tenant farmers' children. He had stopped to ask after sick animals and difficult harvests and the progress of the new schoolroom. He had been the particular kind of lord that England in that era occasionally produced, one who understood that the land he owned was also the world other people lived in, and who took both facts seriously. His son, from the evidence available at this distance, had inherited the estate, but not the understanding. He was, the village concluded, a man of accounts and efficiency. He was the most feared duke in England, and he cared nothing for the human details. He had ridden ahead of his carriage that evening because after 2 years of London, he needed air that was not London air, and because the Ravensmoor Valley in autumn, whatever else he felt about it, was one of the genuinely beautiful things the world contained. He had been told the weather would hold until morning. He had been told wrong. The storm came in from the west with the particular aggression of autumn storms that have been gathering strength over open moorland for days before they finally make their intentions known. No preliminary drizzle, no polite warning, simply darkness, and then rain, and then lightning that made the lane between the village and the estate road briefly, starkly white. His horse, a 17-hand gray named Achilles, who had served him reliably through 3 years of London roads and was not accustomed to open moorland and electrical storms, had not taken the change in conditions philosophically. Elara Voss was returning from the Pemberton house on the far side of the village, where she had delivered 3 baskets of ironed linen and collected 2 shillings and 4 pence for the week's work. She had a lantern, and the lantern was largely useless. The wind had made its feelings about the flame abundantly clear some half-mile back, and she was navigating now by memory and the occasional mercy of lightning. The lane was 4 inches of running water. Her boots were not equal to it. She had stopped minding about her boots some time ago and was concentrating instead on the bend in the road ahead, the place where the lane curved sharply to avoid an old stone wall and then widened toward the village, a turn she had navigated 10,000 times in all weathers, and which she was navigating now by the knowledge stored in the body of someone who has walked the same ground long enough to carry it in their bones. She heard the horse before she saw it. Not the controlled, rhythmic sound of a horse being ridden, something else entirely. The panicked, irregular thunder of hooves that had lost their relationship with instruction, moving far too fast on wet ground. The whites of the animal's eyes catching the lightning as it came around the bend with its head thrown back and its rider, a dark figure, a barely visible, hauling at the reins with the grim, diminishing competence of a man who was losing. The bend was wrong for a horse at that speed on that surface. The stone wall was 15 feet beyond it. Elara understood this in the same instant. She understood everything else, and she moved before anything so deliberate as thought could intervene. She planted herself in the center of the lane. She spread her arms wide, the broken lantern in one hand, the other open and still. And she spoke, not loudly, not theatrically, in the low, carrying voice her father had taught her, the voice that does not command, but simply exists, that says to the animal, "Here is the still place. Here is where the storm ends." The horse saw her. Its stride broke. She caught the bridle on the second attempt. The first sent her skidding sideways into the lane wall, her shoulder striking the stone with a force she would feel for a week, and she held on with both hands, speaking without stopping, keeping the animal's attention locked on her voice, while its body shuddered through the last of its panic. The hooves churned. The rain came down with absolute indifference to everything. Gradually, with agonizing slowness, the trembling stilled. The rider had pulled up 10 feet beyond where she stood. He sat for a long moment without dismounting, and she was aware of him in the way one is aware of things glimpsed in the edge of vision, while the center of attention is elsewhere. Then he dismounted in one motion and walked back through the rain, and in the lightning that came immediately after, and she saw him clearly, tall, dark-coated, features of angular precision, the kind that look as though they were made to be seen from across a room rather than up close in a flooded lane. He looked at her, at the mud on her coat, at her hand still locked in the bridle, at whatever expression her face was wearing, and he said nothing for a long moment. "Are you hurt?" he asked at last. "No." It was almost true. Tomorrow her shoulder would provide a more detailed account. He looked at the horse, now standing quietly under her hand, then back at her, with the expression of a man revising an assessment he had not known he was making. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "My father would have said there is rarely much difference." A pause. He reached into his coat and produced a small purse. He extended it toward her. She did not take it. He studied her with the particular quality of attention that Elara would come, in time, to recognize as his characteristic mode, not calculating, but deeply, genuinely focused, as though the world, when it interested him, received the full force of his concentration. "You have prevented what would have been a significant misfortune," he said. "I acknowledge my debts." "I did not stop the horse to create a debt," she said. "The bend is dangerous in this weather. I simply acted." "Nevertheless, thank you," she said quietly. "But no." She returned the reins to his hand with the measured deliberateness of a woman who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it, then turned to retrieve her lantern from the ditch where it had fallen. She found it. Dented, glass cracked, flame long extinguished, and straightened with it under her arm and looked back at the man who was still standing in the lane watching her, with the purse in his hand, and an expression she could not quite catalogue. "May I know your name?" he asked. She almost did not tell him. Something in his manner, not unkind, but measuring, made her want simply to disappear into the dark. But she was not, ultimately, the kind of person who disappeared when the occasion pressed. "Elara Voss," she said. The name landed. She saw it happen, a flicker of recognition, followed by something more complex that moved through his face before he could entirely prevent it. "Thomas Voss," he said quietly. "Was he your father?" "He was." A silence of a different quality from the silences before it. "He was a good man," the Duke of Ravensmoor said. "A very good man." "Yes," she agreed. "He was. Good evening, Your Grace." She walked away through the rain without looking back. She heard him standing still behind her, not following. She walked until the bend took her out of sight, and then she stopped for a moment against the cold stone wall, her hand flat against it, breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been more shaken then she will permit herself to appear. He had known her father's name, not vaguely, not with the comfortable imprecision of a man recalling a servant in passing, with something that felt, even at a distance, like genuine recognition, like weight. She pushed herself away from the wall and walked home through the diminishing rain. The Duke of Ravensmoor arrived at the estate house an hour later, his horse remanded to the stables, found his coat exchanged, and his manner, to the silent observation of the staff who received him, considerably more preoccupied than a man returning home after 2 years' absence might have been expected to appear. He ate little at dinner. He sat for a long time afterward in his father's library, which was the room he always returned to without quite being able to explain why. And he looked at the fire in the manner of a man following a thought to a place he had not anticipated. He summoned Crane at 9 o'clock. Silas Crane arrived with the composed promptness of a man who has been expecting a summons and has had time to arrange his account of things. He was 53, lean and careful in his movements, with the forgettable features of someone who had spent decades cultivating unremarkability as a professional advantage, and he bowed precisely and arranged his hands behind his back with the practiced stillness of a man who had long since learned that visible stillness communicates reliability. "The Voss family," the Duke said without preamble. "Thomas Voss's daughter. She is living in the village?" Not a flicker, not a fractional pause. "Yes, Your Grace. The young woman took lodgings in Ashford Crossing following her father's passing. She works as a laundress, I believe." "And the cottage, Voss's cottage on the home farm. What became of it?" "Reassigned to the current stable master, Your Grace. Voss's family held no formal claim beyond his tenure of service. Standard estate practice upon the cessation of employment. My father made no provision for them." Crane allowed the suggestion of a modest frown, the careful expression of a man reluctant to contradict. "The late Duke left no written instruction regarding the family, Your Grace. I managed the transition in accordance with the estate's customary arrangements." The Duke looked at him for a moment. Crane returned the look with the steady equanimity of a man who has given this account before and found nothing in it to fear. "Very well," the Duke said. "That will be all." After the door closed, he sat for a long time in the library's diminishing fire. His father's portrait hung above the mantel, a broad-shouldered man with the same dark coloring as his son, and an expression of patient, rather gentle authority that Edmund had spent 34 years alternately admiring and falling short of. He thought about a name, Thomas Voss. He had a memory, vague, a worn at the edges, and of his father speaking that name, not in passing, not as one speaks of a servant, with emphasis, with the particular gravity reserved for names that carry obligation. He could not locate the memory precisely, but it was there, and it would not leave him alone. In the cottage at the edge of the village, Elara lay on her narrow pallet in the dark, listening to her grandmother's slow breathing and the last of the rain against the glass, and she thought about a man standing in a flooded lane with something complicated moving behind his composed and careful eyes. She thought about the way he had said her father's name. He had known Thomas Voss, not as a name in an account ledger, but as a man worth remembering. Below the floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, her father's ledgers waited in the dark. They had waited 14 months already. They could wait a little longer. What Elara did not know, what she could not have known, was that in his cottage on the far side of the estate, Silas Crane was already awake, already thinking, already understanding that the Duke had asked, by name, about Thomas Voss's daughter, and already beginning, with the cold, methodical efficiency that had served him so well for 6 years, to consider what needed to be done about it. The morning after the storm, a man came to Elara's cottage. She had not seen him before. A compact, well-dressed figure in his middle 40s, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering messages that are understood to be instructions. He introduced himself as Hollis, which was either a first name or a last name, and he did not clarify which. He said he represented certain interests connected with the Ravensmoor estate. He said he understood that Elara had been through considerable difficulty since her father's passing, and that there were people who wished her well and hoped to ease her circumstances. He then placed a sealed envelope on the table beside the door and said that it contained enough money to establish herself comfortably in Derby or Sheffield, or anywhere else she might prefer, and that the offer was made in a spirit of genuine goodwill. Elara looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the man called Hollis. "Who sent you?" she asked. He said that the details were not material, and that the offer was both generous and time-sensitive. "I see," said Elara. She picked up the envelope and held it out to him. "So tell whoever sent you that I am very comfortable where I am." He did not take the envelope back immediately. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a threat, and was clearly intended to be understood as one. The particular expression of a man who is accustomed to doors opening at the first knock and is recalibrating for a second. "Miss Voss," he said, "it would be in your interest to consider." "Good morning," said Elara, and she closed the door. She stood behind it for a full minute afterward, her hand flat against the wood, her breathing even and deliberate. Then she crossed to the floor beside the pallet, pressed her fingertips to the third board from the left, felt it solid and undisturbed beneath her hand, and released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Meinel Voss watched all of this from the bed with the sharp, quiet attention that old age and long experience had concentrated in her to a remarkable degree. She said nothing until Elara sat down beside her. "He was from Crane," said Nell. "It was not a question." "I believe so." "Then the Duke asked about your father last night." Nell's eyes moved to the window, where the morning was coming in flat and gray after the storm. "Crane would not have moved so fast otherwise. He has been still for 14 months because there was no reason to move. Something changed." Elara had been thinking the same thing since she walked home through the rain. "The Duke knew my father," she said. "Not just as a name in an account ledger. He said he was a good man, in the way one says it about someone remembered." Nell was quiet for a moment. On her hands, folded on the blanket, were very still. "Your father believed the Duke didn't know what was being done in his name," she said at last. "He believed, if he could only get the evidence to the right man directly, not through Crane, not through any agent of the estate, that the Duke would act. That was always the plan. Always. Papa died before the plan was ready." "Yes." The old woman's voice carried the flat weight of a fact, long since absorbed into the structure of living. "But the ledgers are still here, and so are you." Elara said nothing. She looked at the window and thought about a man standing in a flooded lane, with something she could not yet name moving behind his eyes. 2 days after Hollis's visit, she saw the Duke again. She had not intended to. She was delivering pressed linen to the household of the estate's head tenant farmer, a man named Garrett, who occupied the largest of the farm properties on the eastern edge of the Ravensmoor lands, and who had always, even in the years of Crane's management, maintained his accounts carefully and his obligations promptly. She was on the path that ran along the field boundary, the shorter route that saved half a mile, when she heard footsteps on the same path ahead of her. Deliberate, unhurried steps, the steps of a man walking with purpose but not haste, and looked up to find the Duke of Ravensmoor coming toward her from the direction of the eastern drainage channel that bordered the field. He was not dressed for a formal inspection. He wore riding clothes and boots muddied to the knee. No, and he carried a folded paper under his arm, in the manner of a man who has been consulting something and has not yet finished with it. He looked, she thought, like a man doing arithmetic in his head, whose answers keep coming out wrong. He stopped when he saw her, and she had the impression, brief, quickly controlled, that he was not entirely displeased. "Miss Voss," he said, "Your Grace." She kept walking. The basket was heavy, and Garrett's household expected her before noon. "A moment, if you please." She stopped. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention that had been her father's most characteristic gift to her. The gaze of someone who is not performing composure, but genuinely possesses it, which is a different thing, and which most people who encounter it can sense the difference without being able to name it. "I have been looking at this drainage channel," the Duke said, gesturing behind him with the folded paper. "My steward's accounts show that it was re-engineered at considerable expense 2 years ago. A new system of sluice gates, a deepened course for the eastern quarter-mile." He looked at her steadily. "It has plainly not been touched in considerably longer than 2 years." Elara looked at the channel. She had walked past it 2 or 3 times a week for 11 months. She looked back at the Duke. "No," she said carefully, "it has not." A pause in which he watched her with that focused, unwavering attention. "You know this land," he said. It was not quite a question. "I grew up on it," she replied. "I walked every path on these fields from the time I could walk at all. My father," she paused, measuring. "My father managed every account connected with this estate, including the drainage works, for 22 years. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Then he unfolded the paper. She could see now that it was a section of the estate accounts, figures and columns, and held it so she could see it without being invited to look, a gesture she recognized as deliberate. Column after column of expenditures, neatly recorded. "If a woman who grew up on this land were to look at these figures," he said, in the tone of a man framing a question with great care, "would she be able to tell me whether they accurately reflect what she has observed?" Elara set the laundry basket down on the path. She took the paper. She read it, not quickly, not as a performance of quickness, but with the thorough and unhurried attention of someone who has been reading account ledgers since childhood and understands every column. The Duke watched her. He did not speak. He waited with the patience, she noted, of a man who understood that interrupting would cost him more than it saved. "The sluice gate repairs in the eastern quarter are listed here at £43 and 12 shillings, she said. "Paid to a contractor named Fenworth of Derby. The drainage channel has not been touched. There is no Fenworth in Derby who specializes in drainage works. My father used the Fenworth firm for the North Pasture Channel in '69, and they closed their operation the following year." She turned the page. "This listed improvement to the grain storage on Home Farm. I passed that building not 3 days ago. The roof still leaks through the same 2 places it has always leaked through. £19 recorded here for repairs." She refolded the paper and handed it back. The Duke received it without expression. His hands were very still. "How many accounts like this are there?" Elara said quietly. "In the full ledger?" He looked at her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something rawer than that. The expression of a man who has begun to understand the full dimension of something he suspected only partially. "I intend to find out," he said. She picked up her laundry basket. "Then I would suggest you find out quickly, Your Grace," she said, "before whoever is responsible understands that you are looking." She walked on toward Garrett's farmhouse. She heard him standing still behind her, as he had stood still in the lane during the storm, and she did not look back. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She told Nell about the conversation that evening, while her grandmother ate the thin broth that was all her appetite would accommodate these days. Nell's health had been declining slowly since summer, not dramatically, not with the sudden urgency that would have required a doctor Elara could not afford, but steadily in the manner of a tide going out, leaving less each day. "He is looking at the accounts," Nell said. "Yes." "Then Crane knows, or will know soon." The old woman's eyes were steady. "If the Duke is examining account by account, Crane will see it in the steward's ledger where access is recorded. He will understand what it means." "I know." "And you, Ellie, if Crane has connected you to whatever memory the Duke has of your father, if he believes you might have something—" Nell did not finish. "The man came 2 days ago," Elara said, "with money." Nell nodded slowly. "The next thing he sends will not be money." She was right. 3 days later, Elara came home from the Pemberton house to find the cottage door standing 3 inches open. She had locked it. She always locked it. She stood on the threshold for a moment, reading the space without entering it. The slight disorder that was not quite the disorder she had left. The pallet shifted 2 inches from where she had placed it that morning. The kitchen chair turned at a fractionally different angle. A thorough search, done quickly, and by someone experienced enough to nearly conceal that it had been done at all. The floorboards had been tested. She could see the marks where a careful instrument had probed the gaps. But the third board from the left, where she had reinforced the nails and run a thin line of wax around the seam to prevent it lifting without clear effort, was undisturbed. They had not found the ledgers. They would come back. They would come back with more time and more certainty, and next time they might not bother to be careful about concealing it. Elara sat in the kitchen chair for a long time, looking at the floor, while the light changed toward evening. She thought about her father working by lamplight on those same ledgers, a recording figure after figure with the careful hand of a man who understood that the difference between a truth and a provable truth is the precision of its documentation. She thought about what he had said. Enough to ruin a man, enough to give you back everything they took. And she thought about an estate manager's daughter who had grown up knowing every path on these fields, now sitting in a cold, rented kitchen with her father's evidence under the floorboards and a powerful man's attention finally, cautiously, turning in the right direction. The question had always been, how do you get the evidence to the right man directly, without it being intercepted, without it being dismissed, without Crane moving to remove both the evidence and the person carrying it before it can be heard? The answer had always been the problem. Well, it was Nell who solved it. in the way that Nell solved most problems, quietly, and by asking the right question at the right time. She asked it 4 days later, when her breathing had grown worse, and Elara was sitting with her through the long middle hours of a sleepless night, one hand covering her grandmother's papery fingers. "The Duke knows who you are," Nell said, not to the ceiling, to Elara directly. "He has spoken with you twice now. He's examining the accounts because you showed him what to look for. He remembers your father's name you said with weight. Yes. Then he will hear you." The old woman's grip tightened. "Not a letter, Ellie. Letters go through Crane, not a message. Messages go through Crane, you yourself. With the ledgers under your arm. You walk to that estate house, and you ask to speak with him directly, and you put your father's evidence in the hands of the man it was always meant to reach. Crane will know the moment I approach the gates." "Crane knows already," Nell said, with the flat clarity of a woman who has lived 71 years and has used all of them. "The question is not whether Crane knows. The question is whether you move before he does, or after." Elara looked at her grandmother's face in the candlelight, sharp and certain, and she thought with a quiet tightening of the chest, considerably more tired than it had been a month ago. She thought about the morning she had stopped the horse in the flooded lane, and the Duke had looked at her afterward, with that expression she could not catalogue. She thought about him standing by the drainage channel with his folded accounts and the wrong numbers adding themselves up in his mind. She thought about her father's careful hand, column after column, year after year, evidence gathered in the faith that it would someday reach the right place. She had waited 14 months. She had been careful and patient and entirely invisible, and Crane had found her anyway, not through carelessness, but simply because the Duke had asked her name, and that single question had illuminated her existence to the man who had the most reason to want her gone. The waiting was over, whether she was ready or not. She went the following morning. She rose before light, dressed in the cleanest things she owned, and took the ledgers from beneath the floor, both of them, heavy and solid in her hands, the brown leather worn smooth where her father had carried them. She wrapped them carefully in the square of oilcloth she had kept them in, and then in her shawl on top of that, because the October air was cold and damp, and these ledgers had survived too much to be undone by the weather. She made Nell's breakfast first. She banked the kitchen fire so it would hold through the morning. She stood at the door of the cottage for a moment and looked back at the small, whitewashed room with its repaired window latch and its 2 borrowed chairs and the narrow pallet folded against the wall, and she thought, "If this goes wrong, I will lose even this." Then she thought, "If I do nothing, I will lose even this anyway." She walked out into the cold October morning and began the half-mile to the Ravensmoor estate. The fields on either side of the lane were bare and frost silver in the early light, the hedgerows stripped to their bones by the advancing season, the sky above them the particular pale gray that preceded the sun in late autumn. Not darkness, not yet light, but the tentative in-between that belongs to people who are up before the world has decided what the day intends to be. She did not let herself think too carefully about what she was walking toward. She had found, over the past 14 months, that thinking too carefully about necessary things was the enemy of doing them. She thought instead about her father, about his voice, about the evenings he had spent at the kitchen table with these same ledgers spread before him and the lamp burning low, working with the focused patience of a man who understood that justice, when it comes, generally comes slowly and through the effort of someone willing to do the slow work required. She thought about the way he had always said, when she was small and impatient with something, "The truth doesn't need to be in a hurry, Ellie. It just needs to get there." She was getting it there. The Ravensmoor estate house appeared as she came around the long curve of the approach lane. Limestone and age, 3 stories of solid, composed authority against the pale sky, its windows catching the first thin light of the morning. The elm trees along the avenue were bare now, their branches making clean, dark lines against the gray. The gate stood ahead, iron and deliberate, and before them, moving from the gatehouse with the quick, alert purpose of a man who has been watching the lane from an early hour, came a figure in Ravensmoor livery. Elara did not slow her pace. She had her father's ledgers under her arm and the right angle of her chin, and she walked toward the gates of Ravensmoor as though she had been expected. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because it had happened in the private hours of the morning she had spent banking the fire and wrapping the ledgers, was that Silas Crane had also risen early that day. He had sent a second message to the landlord Beckett before 7 o'clock. He had also, in the same hour, dispatched a rider to a solicitor in Derby, with whom he had a long and carefully concealed relationship, carrying a document he had prepared several days ago against the possibility of exactly this eventuality. The document contained a formal complaint against one Elara Voss of Ashford Crossing, accusing her of having misappropriated certain account papers belonging to the estate of Ravensmoor at the time of her father's employment. A claim as false as every other instrument Crane had ever deployed, but crafted with the same meticulous attention to plausibility that had served him so well for 6 years. Crane was not a man who moved carelessly. He had understood from the moment the Duke asked about Thomas Voss's daughter that the situation had entered a new phase. He had searched the cottage and found nothing, which told him only that the evidence was better hidden than he had anticipated, not that it did not exist. He had sent Hollis and been refused, which had confirmed that the girl had something worth protecting. And now the Duke was walking the fields and examining accounts and asking questions that should have been asked 3 years ago, and everything that Crane had built, carefully, patiently, one falsified invoice at a time, was depending entirely on whether he could discredit Elara Voss before she could speak. The gateman opened the Ravensmoor gate for her. She had given her name clearly and asked, in a voice that did not waver, to speak with His Grace directly on a matter of some importance. The gateman looked at her plain coat and her careful face and the wrapped parcel under her arm, and he made the sort of judgment that gatemen make, the rapid, imperfect calculus of tone and bearing and intention. Then he stepped aside and let her through. Elara walked up the elm avenue toward the estate house, through the gravel quiet under her feet, the bare branches moving overhead in the early morning air, and she carried her father's evidence with both hands, and she didn't look back. She was made to wait in a small anteroom off the entrance hall, not unkindly, not with any suggestion of contempt, but with the measured neutrality of a household whose staff had been trained under Silas Crane and had learned to be careful about unannounced visitors. A fire had been lit. There was a chair. Elara did not sit in it. She stood near the window with the wrapped ledgers against her side and watched the avenue of elms in the early light and waited with the stillness that had been her most reliable companion through 14 months of very little going right. She heard Crane before she saw him, His footsteps in the corridor had a particular quality: unhurried, deliberate. The footsteps of a man who is controlling the pace of an encounter before it begins. He opened the anteroom door and looked at her with the colorless, composed expression she imagined he wore for every occasion. And he said, in a voice of impeccable reasonableness, that His Grace was occupied with estate business, and that Miss Voss would be better served by writing a formal letter, which he himself would be happy to ensure was delivered promptly. Elara looked at him. He was the man who had dismissed her father on false charges. He was the man who had sent Hollis with a bribe. He was the man who had searched her cottage. Looking at him now, in the clear morning light of the house her father had served for 22 years, she felt something that wasn't anger. Anger was too hot for what she felt, but the cold, clear weight of absolute certainty. The certainty that she had come to the right place at the right time, and that she was not leaving. "Please tell His Grace," she said, "that Elara Voss is here with Thomas Voss's account ledgers. Tell him exactly that, and then let him decide whether he is occupied." Something moved in Crane's face. Fractional, controlled, but there. The first flaw she had ever seen in his composure, as thin as a crack in good plaster, and just as telling. He left without another word. She waited. 3 minutes later, a footman appeared and asked her to follow him. The Duke was in his father's library. He was standing when she entered, not behind the desk in the posture of a man receiving a subordinate, but near the window, in the posture of a man who had been moving when the knock came and had not thought to arrange himself differently. He looked at her, then at the parcel under her arm, and he said simply, "Sit down, Miss Voss. Please." She sat. She placed the ledgers on the table between them and unwrapped them from the shawl and the oilcloth and set them before him. 2 thick volumes, brown leather worn smooth with handling, her father's initials pressed into the lower corner of each cover. "My father kept these for 6 years," she said. "The last 2 years of his life, he kept them at considerable risk to himself, because he had found evidence of systematic fraud in the Ravensmoor accounts, and he always believed, that if he could document it precisely enough and place it directly in the hands of the right person would act on it." The Duke looked at the ledgers. He did not reach for them immediately. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. "He was removed before he could bring them to you," Elara continued. "The complaint against him was manufactured. His pension was withheld without legal basis. The cottage, our home for 20 years, was reassigned within a fortnight of his death." She kept her voice even. Not because she did not feel it. She felt all of it every day. But because her father had not spent 6 careful years on documentation only to have his daughter undermine it with the appearance of grievance rather than the substance of evidence. "I am not here to ask for sympathy. I am here because these ledgers belong in this room, and because the man who should have received them 3 years ago is sitting across from me now." The Duke opened the first ledger. He read in silence. She watched him read, the quality of his attention, the way his expression moved through the stages of a man absorbing something that has multiple layers, each one requiring revision of the one before. He turned pages with the careful, unhurried deliberateness of someone who understands that a document that matters deserves that treatment. Occasionally he paused, and she saw him making the connection between what was written and what he had seen in the fields. the drainage channel, the grain store roof, a dozen other details that had been quietly accumulating into a question he had not yet known how to ask. He reached a section near the middle of the second ledger and went very still, and he was still for a long time. "Miss Voss," he said at last. His voice had changed, not dramatically, but with something quieter and more durable than drama. "Did your father know that in compiling this evidence, he would very likely be removed before he could use it?" "He knew," she said. "He told me in his last weeks that Crane had become aware of what he was doing, that the dismissal was coming regardless of what he did or did not do." "Then why did he continue?" Elara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the bare elms moved in the morning light, patient and unhurried, the movement of things that have weathered many seasons. "Because he believed in this house," she said, "in what it had been, and what it could still be under the right stewardship. He had served your father for 22 years, and your father was the kind of man my father believed was worth protecting, even at cost." She paused. He thought the same might be true of the son. The Duke looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely beyond professional assessment. The expression of a man being shown the full dimension of a debt he had not known he owed. "There is something in these ledgers," he said, "beyond the financial evidence." He turned to a page near the end of the second volume. Not figures, but prose in her father's careful hand. A narrative account of the dismissal and its consequences, dated and detailed. And at the end of it, a single paragraph that her father had never read aloud to her, that she had never seen until this moment, which she read now across the table in the morning light. It said, "I do not write this out of bitterness. I write it because the son of the man who called me friend deserves to know the truth of what has been done in his name. I saved nothing of consequence when I pulled young Edmund Harcastle from the ice of the lower pond in the winter of his 8th year. His father saved a great deal when he shook my hand afterward and told me that a Voss would always have a home on Ravensmoor land. I have tried to be worth that promise. I hope these ledgers are sufficient evidence of it." The library was very quiet. The Duke closed the book. His hands rested on the worn cover. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance, at the particular invisible point that people look at when they are understanding something that takes the full force of their attention to understand. Then he stood, crossed to the door, and spoke to the footman outside with a voice of absolute, unambiguous instruction. Less than 2 minutes later, Silas Crane was shown into the library. He came in with his customary composure. He saw the ledgers on the table. He saw the Duke's face. And the composure did not break, but it became, in the space of a single breath, a different thing entirely. No longer the ease of a man confident in his position. The held stillness of a man who understands that what he is standing in is not a room, but a reckoning. "These are Thomas Voss's account ledgers," the Duke said. "I have spent the last hour reading them. I will have them verified by an independent firm from London this week. You will not leave this estate until that process is complete. You will surrender every volume of the estate accounts, immediately, to my personal secretary." He paused. "If the review confirms what these ledgers contain, and I believe it will, because Thomas Voss was a meticulous and honest man, and I am quite certain you know that better than anyone, you will face civil and criminal proceedings. Is that understood?" Crane's eyes moved, once, to Elara, and what was in them in that single instant was not the professional composure she had always observed at a distance, but something older and smaller. The expression of a man who made a calculation 6 years ago and has discovered it was wrong. Then his gaze moved away. He said nothing. He was escorted out by 2 members of the house staff before noon. The independent review took 8 days. It confirmed everything. What followed was not swift. Justice rarely is, but it was thorough. The civil proceedings recovered the greater part of what had been taken. The criminal trial in the spring returned a verdict of guilty on 4 counts, including the wrongful termination of Thomas Voss's employment and the fraudulent withholding of his pension. Crane went to prison. The solicitor who had prepared the false complaint against Elara was disbarred. The cottage on the home farm was returned to Nell and Elara Voss before the end of October, formally in writing, with the Duke's own signature and a provision attached at his instruction giving both women legal occupancy for the remainder of their natural lives, independent of any change in the estate's future management. Nell moved back in on a Thursday morning. She sat in the kitchen of the home she had last seen 20 months ago and looked around it slowly, and then looked at her granddaughter and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Thomas Voss's pension, the full 22 years of it, withheld without basis, was paid to his family in settlement, with interest the following spring. The Duke sent for Elara one final time in December, in the week before Christmas, when the estate was quiet and the Elm Avenue was silver with frost. She came to the library again, the room that had held the most important conversation of her life. And he was seated, and she sat across from him, and between them on the table was a single document. He told her that the estate required a new manager, that the position had been functionally vacant since Thomas Voss's removal, that Crane had managed accounts but had never managed land, and the land showed it. What he needed was someone who knew every path on these fields, who could read a ledger at a glance and see immediately where the figures were wrong. He told her he understood it was an unusual appointment. He told her he did not particularly care about that. Elara looked at the document. Then she looked at the man across the table, at his composed, careful face, and the eyes that were not cold. She understood now, but simply very still. The eyes of someone who had learned to keep things quiet rather than let them be seen carelessly. "My father would have called this justice," she said. "I would call it approximately half of what is owed," the Duke replied. "The rest is a longer conversation." She took the document. She signed it. Outside the library window, the Ravensmoor Elm Avenue stood in its winter quiet, bare and patient. The trees that the Duke's grandfather had planted in the faith that what one builds in good faith endures. The same faith that had kept Thomas Voss at his ledgers through 2 years of risk, recording the truth in careful columns for a daughter he trusted to carry it the rest of the way. The truth, he had always told her, does not need to be in a hurry. It just needs to get there. It had. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.